The Chinese QJ, JS, and SY classes were the last steam locomotives in regular revenue service anywhere in the world. These locomotives were being built into the 80s and 90s, and they were operated into the 21st century. While the QJs retired in the mid-2000s, the SYs and JSs soldiered on not just into the 2010s, but into the 2020s, with the last JSs reportedly running as late as 2024. Even before I finished my SY, I had considered building a JS. The SY had very little weight over the drivers and could not pull much, whereas the JS would have room for the motor and battery in the locomotive and could hopefully pull more. Also, I would find more issues with the SY, from a handful of fragile greebles to difficulty connecting the tender, but I never got to the JS because I could never find a drawing. Until now. Cosmetically, the JS has features from both the QJ and the SY, but I think this model looks significantly better than my old QJ model and marginally better than my old SY model. That being said, I had much worse part selection for the QJ and more physical constraints for both the QJ and the SY. In general, I used a ton of my favorite relatively recent parts, like the 1x1 semicircle and the rounded 1x2 plate. I even used some even more recent parts for the first time, like the 1x1 with clip on bottom and the rounded 1x4 plate. I made the boiler 5 3/5 studs wide instead of a full 6 studs wide. 6 wide boilers need some shenanigans to add 1 LU to each face, and filling the gap can cut into space for electronics. In the QJ, I ran wiring in those 1 LU gaps, but I also left them exposed, which hurt aesthetics. The PRR duplexes avoid this problem by having the streamlined casing. The greebles on the boiler still gave me a lot of trouble, since each feature needs a plate behind it to support the feature itself or the slope bricks around it. I can't put these plates in the same place on 2 adjacent faces, so I had to interleave features or the slope bricks in a complicated way. I usually attach railings to the top of boilers, but that felt too high on the JS. I subsequently installed them on the sides of the boiler with claws inserted through 2 plates with holes such that the railings and claws would not rotate easily. I don't know if this will hold up in practice, but it seems sturdy enough in isolation. On some of my older engines, including the SY, the railings and the steps form a parallelogram that could deform somewhat easily. This annoyed me enough such that on the JS, I attached the railing to fixed bars and made the steps out of click hinges. The chassis has an air tank greeble similar to that on the QJ. These tanks connect to rounded 1x2 plates tilted slightly downward, such that robot arms can carry a bar above them. This gives the bars just enough clearance to miss the running boards above. The rear truck has a frame similar to that on the SY, but I opted not to use the existing design due to its fragility. The cab steps on the QJ should also look closer to these on the JS than whatever I did back then. Mechanically, the JS has the same chassis articulation as the SY. The front and rear trucks swing freely, and the body pivots above the first driver and near the last axle. The front cylinder still needs a cutout to clear the front wheel. Moving the rear pivot forward relative to the SY marginally increases the rear overhang in turns, but keeps marginally more weight over the drivers at the same time. This setup also requires more space between the engine and tender to keep them clear in R40 turns, and I still have to truncate these rear grab irons. Does such a small change in lateral weight distribution actually help? With a AAA battery box, not the LiPo battery box, the locomotive weighs 650 grams and can pull around 250 grams on straight metal track. On a metal R40 curve, it can manage about 200 grams. These figures correspond to overall coefficients of friction of 0.38 and 0.30, significantly better than those achieved by the SY, but they also represent a best case scenario for the JS with clean tires on metal track. I also used thin third-party tires instead of the fat official red rubber bands. When reversing through certain track geometries under load, the rear driver could climb joints and derail, most likely from a combination of torque on the bogie, pushing the wheel into the curve, and the weight of the locomotive shifting away from said wheel. I hope the thinner O-rings will mitigate this issue by exposing less of the flange in general. The drivetrain also has the same layout as that of the SY, but I geared it 3-5 for more torque instead of 1-1 for more speed. In this video, I mostly drove the JS with a Mold King L motor, but it could accept an M motor and some other motors as well. Unfortunately, one motor I would want to use, the Technic large motor for powered up, might not fit due to the extra length. Electrically, the wiring situation is as obnoxious as ever. I have no place to put the receiver except at the very front, and I have to orient the battery box with the connector in the back. This means the receiver wire barely can't reach, and I have to use an entire extender to bridge a small gap. This wire passes over the battery through a 1 LU gap, and both the motor and receiver wires need to route around the drive gear in front. at least no wire needs to run to the tender, and the entire boiler and cab open to access the electronics. Operationally, all the greebles on the boiler make the locomotive somewhat difficult to pick up, but I do have a structurally sound pair of clips close to the center of gravity. I tried to make the tender easier to connect than the SY tender. The large gap between the locomotive and tender and the increased clearance over the trailing axle both help a lot. The drawbar has just enough room to drop over an axle pin. Speaking of the tender, it looks more like a QJ tender than an SY tender, and it does not have too much to talk about. It has a bunch of panels to smooth out the sides and some greebles on the rear deck and face. I did guess a bit on the front face because I could not find any good reference images. The bogies also have roughly the same design as the QJ bogies, but the 9-stud long frame rails carry bearing greebles offset by half a stud, which give the frames just one stud of connection to the bogies. These can subsequently yaw left and right a little, but at least I figured out how to give the supporting bracket 2 studs of connection. Finally, since the JS uses number 9 drivers, I can make it a fully purist build by pushing out the tender frames by a plate to accommodate official number 5 wheels on 6-length axles. I would also like to thank 3-foot gauge Lego Man on the battery-powered bricks Discord for providing not 1, but 2 JS drawings. On that note, this is the end of the video. Please consider subscribing if you like what we do, and have a nice day.